Good afternoon. My name is Christine Phillips, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's episode of the Inside Grants webinar series. Thank you for joining me today. You may have worked with Team DWC in the past, or you may have attended one of the other Inside Grants webinars. But in case we have new people, let me tell you a little bit about the company. DWC was started in 2020 by Dave Wickstrom, who's both a former Fed and a former federal grantee. Dave had a singular focus. He wanted to help nonprofit organizations like yours navigate the federal grants landscape, and particularly to help nonprofits successfully manage compliance with federal requirements, which we all know can be somewhat less than intuitive. Over the last 5 years, DWC has trained more than 15,000 people and has been a trusted partner to more than 230 nonprofits and nearly 150 federal agencies. And they've supported the successful management of more than $10 billion in funding, literally around the world. In fact, normally there'd be two of us presenting, but I'm flying solo today because Dave and several of the others you've been hearing from on the Inside Grants webinars are in Saipan, working with the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands public school system. DWC's bench has deepened since 2020, and today the team includes more than a dozen former federal staff with decades of hands-on grants management experience. Most of us left federal service recently, and not exactly voluntarily. And all of us still care deeply about the missions we supported as public servants. We're still committed to supporting your critical work. Through Team DWC, we get to do that. And now a bit about me. I'm one of the newest additions to the team. Until this summer, I was the communications director for the Administration for Community Living. I was with ACL for about 11 years, and my team and I spent our days, and more than a few evenings and weekends, getting the word out about issues affecting older adults and people with disabilities, how community living benefits everyone, and how your programs and the others that ACL funds make it possible for all people to live the lives they want to live in their communities. Before ACL, I spent just under 10 years as a civilian with the Department of Defense. And before I was a Fed, I worked in corporate, agency, and nonprofit public relations. In addition, for the last 26 years, I also have had the privilege of serving as a Navy Reserve Public Affairs Officer, and now I'm proud to be part of the team at DWC. Throughout my career, one of the things that has almost always ended up being a big part of my job is serving as a translator, really, or specifically, turning corporate speak and legal language and bureaucratese or technical information into language that means something to the average person, and also teaching other people to communicate in plain English. So I've become kind of a plain language evangelist and a conscientious objector to the way the government sometimes communicates, often communicates. And I've been unabashedly recruiting converts, so thank you for joining me today. So you might be asking yourself, if DWC is focused on managing grants, what are they doing with me, and why are we doing a webinar on communications? I am glad you asked that question. Here's why. Now more than ever, it is critical for federal grantees to seize every opportunity to illustrate the crucial impact your programs have on the lives of real people. And it's critical to do so clearly, consistently, and compellingly. But often, when people think about telling their story, they only think of materials created for that purpose. And I'm talking about here things like websites, social media, fundraising, and marketing materials. What they don't think about is things like their grant documents. I'm talking about everything from applications and proposals to program plans and performance reports, and even routine communications with funding agencies. Every one of those is an opportunity to tell your story that you can't afford to pass up. And too often, people think of telling the story as the job of someone like me, or at least someone other than them. And yes, your communications people are absolutely important. They absolutely should be part of your leadership teams and embedded into operational planning. And I can talk a long time about all of that and why it's important. But I digress, and that is a soapbox for another day. The truth is that everyone who creates materials that leave your organization is a communicator. And they are telling your story to people who make decisions about your programs in many cases. Given the world we're living in today and the funding environment everyone is navigating, the stakes are too high for federal government grantees to not be intentional about how you're communicating your impact. And that's where the idea for this webinar came from. we thought it would be helpful to share some pointers about how you can make sure you're telling the story you want told and some of the common pitfalls that get in the way of doing that. So let's start with the basics of effective communication. I have to beg forgiveness here. I fell prey to a cliche. It seems there are 3 C's for everything, but this is probably a cliche for a reason, so I decided to go with it. 3 C's to keep in mind when you're communicating about your programs, regardless of where and how you're doing it, are clarity, so people understand what you do, consistency, so people believe you, and compelling storytelling, so people understand why what you're telling them about matters. Let's start with clarity. A good test of whether something is clear is to ask yourself whether my mom, for example, who lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and probably knows nothing about what you do, would understand what you do after reading your materials. And more importantly, would she follow the point you're making about the effect of your work? And if we're being honest, this is often not the strongest point for either advocacy communications or for federal communications. The good news is that fixing this one isn't complicated. But I'll stop short of saying it's easy. It often isn't, because it requires people to give up the words that they're most comfortable with and to speak in a language that's maybe a little bit different from what they're used to. There are a few things you can start with, though, to make your communications clear enough for anyone to understand what you mean. First and foremost, start by using plain language that your audience will understand, or in other words, speak and write human. There are a handful of things that I think most frequently work against this concept in communication about federal programs. And if you're writing to fight for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow, or the American way if you're watching old school Superman, the following are the kryptonite that you need to avoid in your communications. First, avoid bureaucratese and statute language. Saying we provided 5,000 units of services doesn't mean a lot, even internally in a lot of cases. I can tell you at ACL, when I would see a performance metric or something that talked about units of services, and I'd ask the program team, hey, what are we talking about here? So I could try to find a way to use that data point. A lot of times they didn't even know. So I know that there are a lot of cases where programs provide a variety of different kinds of services or benefits or deliverables to accomplish an objective, and they can't all be measured the same way. So some might be hours of services, others might be numbers of tasks completed. And so programs default to saying units as a way to capture both things. And there's situations where there's really no way around that, where it might even be good to do for the purpose of what you're communicating. There's some reports where that makes sense. But if you're selecting examples to highlight what you do, it's better to choose one that can be described in a way that everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. And one of the ways you can do that is to take that example of things that you're measuring in units and break it down into its different pieces and talk about the numbers associated with each of those in the terms that make sense for those. The next type of kryptonite to avoid would be jargon and words and phrases that mean something different in your world than they mean to most people. A good example of that is person-centered. Now, in the aging and disability networks, everyone knows what that means. But outside of social services, not necessarily. Doctors think they're being person-centered, for example, when all of the doctors get together to coordinate and decide what's best for the person they're treating, whether or not they included the person they're treating in those conversations. And of course, that's not remotely what we mean by person-centered. So it's often better to describe what we're talking about instead of using the label. So instead of saying we provided person-centered planning, for example, instead say we work with older adults and people with disabilities to determine what services best meet their needs as defined by them. You can then say this person-centered approach ensures the person receiving services is in the driver's seat and the person will understand what you're talking about. It's also important to avoid euphemisms in most cases. And this one is sticky because it often can fly in the face of the language of advocacy. Often in advocacy, there's an intentional decision to try to change the language around an issue, to destigmatize or to avoid blaming. But it's important to be aware that euphemisms also really can get in the way of plain language, and they can create distractions for the person you're trying to persuade. if you're asking them to think in terms that are too far outside of common speech. So one example of this would be using person-first language in situations where people typically wouldn't. So, for example, someone once told me that they preferred woman who is older to older woman. And if I were writing to that person or to a group of people who I knew felt that way, I would try to remember to honor that. But most people simply would say older woman. And to them, woman who is older would sound really weird. And that creates a mental speed bump that can get in the way of them focusing on the main point I'm trying to make. So for most of my communications, I'm just going to say older woman. And I'm going to come back to this one a little bit later. It's important to limit acronyms. And this is one that federal agencies and grantees often miss. We love to do a couple of things with acronyms that really can get in the way of understanding in documents. A big one is introducing acronyms for phrases that aren't used again or are only used a couple of times. Generally speaking, don't bring an acronym into the picture unless spelling it out is going to get really weird throughout your document. So if you're using it a lot of times, it makes sense, but oftentimes it's just better to continue spelling it out throughout the document. When you do bring acronyms in, don't want to over-define them. If an acronym is commonly known or clear from context, you don't need to put the acronym next to the first use. So for example, if you say the Administration for Community Living in the first sentence, and you want to say ACL after that, you do not have to put ACL in parentheses after the spelled out version on that first use. And doing so actually makes your document harder to read. You also don't want to introduce too many acronyms. For most documents, 2 or 3 is probably the max that you want to include. When you have too many, what happens is people spend their time going back and forth to find where you define them every time they encounter one. So this addresses some of the most common issues that I see most often with plain language. And if you want to dig into this more, there's a lot more that you can do. There's a lot of other things to think about, and this can really be its own discussion, and Team DWC would be happy to help you with that. There's also a really good government website you can use as sort of a DIY resource. And I spent longer than I should admit trying to work this into the Superman metaphor. I feel like I failed you because I couldn't get there. But check out plainlanguage.gov and go to Explore Writing for Understanding. When you go to that URL, you're going to be redirected to a page within digital.gov. I don't know why they killed the old site. It was actually easier to use. But this page within, or the section within digital.gov, still has most of the key info that was really helpful. In addition to using plain language, it's important to focus on outcomes, not outputs. You want the so what to be clear. So saying we held 25 training sessions tells my mom you were busy, maybe, if she understands whether that's a lot for the period you're talking about, but it doesn't really tell her why it matters. But if you add, we helped 250 people with disabilities learn how to request the accommodations they need to succeed at work, she starts to understand why this is important. Using data can help people understand what you're saying. But you do want to make sure you can look at the various ways it can be parsed. So for example, make sure you're considering overall funding if you're citing numbers of people served, and take care not to inadvertently create perceptions of astronomical per person costs. So in our example here, 250 people sounds pretty good if this was funded with a grant for $100,000. But if your program received $10 million and you talk about 250 people benefiting, it's going to be important to make clear somewhere that this is only one of the many things you do. Brevity is a virtue, but it's also really important to make sure that you are providing enough information to provide the context. So in this case, my mom might not understand why teaching self-advocacy is important. She may not understand, or may not be aware how big of a barrier to fully participating in society that can be for people with disabilities. So you want to make that clear. Here we add a little bit of the problem statement, or problem of what your program is trying to address, and now she understands why this is really important. And then there's the KISS principle. Keep it simple, silly pants. You thought I was going to say stupid, didn't you? I would never. I'm too grateful that you're here. But the point here is don't tackle too many concepts in one vignette if you can avoid it. So the example here focuses on only one barrier to employment. You're talking about one thing done to address that one barrier. A lot of times in an example like this, the writer will bring in a long list of all the barriers and then go back and talk about how they addressed the one. In that case, you end up losing the point, and it actually minimizes the impact of what you're saying. So that's clarity in, okay, a bit more than a nutshell. Next, let's talk about consistency. Why is consistency important? All right, bottom line, consistency builds trust, and it ultimately builds your brand. If your messages are consistent across platforms and your actions match your words, people will understand what you're about and they'll believe what you say. And when you repeat your key points consistently, your message starts to stick. So if you think about your communications like a drum beat, one clear beat repeated over time is powerful. It gives some people something to follow. But if it's just random beats scattered everywhere, that is just noise. When you're thinking about consistency, it's important to think about two different dimensions. There's message consistency and data consistency. Message consistency means having a unified narrative. If you're talking about your organization, it's a clear statement of who you are, what you do, and why it matters. And everyone on your team should be able to describe your organization or program in 1 or 2 sentences using similar language. That helps your partners and stakeholders and even the people you serve speak about your work in a cohesive way. So at ACL, one of the things we would boil it down to is we help older adults and people with disabilities stay active and independent in their communities. Now, message consistency does not always mean that you should use identical language everywhere. In fact, it's absolutely critical to tailor your message to your audience and your delivery vehicle. But you should have a variety of examples that show how you help real people, and you should lead to the bottom lines. Now, data consistency means aligning your facts, figures, and outcomes across reports and presentations. If one report says you serve 10,000 people and another says 9,000, that small difference can raise questions about your credibility, cause people not to trust either number. In my experience, we often see data inconsistency because we're mixing data from one year with data from a different year and not making that clear, or because materials aren't consistently updated with the latest numbers. Now, the simplest way to avoid doing this is to make updating materials part of your reporting process. If you create a checklist of all the places that you've used stats, and when you get new ones, go back and update them, you'll stay pretty squared away. But that can be pretty labor intensive and not always realistic. And admittedly, not something we were able to do at ACL. There's just too many different places that stats got used. There's no way we would be able to track all of them that meticulously. So another thing you can do is make sure you're including things like the time frame for the data you're using. If you say in 2024 rather than last year, then if somebody's reading this in 2026, the number won't seem wrong. It will just seem dated, which also tells them to go look for more information or go more updated information. Okay, with that, let's go to the last of 3 C's, which is compelling storytelling. Federal grantees have no shortage of data. You track outputs and outcomes and performance indicators and compliance metrics, all of which are essential and important in telling the story. But by themselves, they usually won't get the point across. You've got to connect the data to the people. So you can show that your program reduced unemployment of people with disabilities by 30%, and that's impressive. But if you also share the story of a disabled veteran who found housing and a job and stability because of that program, that's what stays in people's hearts. So storytelling humanizes your data and connects it to real lives. So where clarity ensures my mom understands what you're talking about, compelling storytelling causes her to care about what you're talking about. And side note, I'm making my mom sound awful here. She both understands and cares. She's just useful for the exercise. So a compelling story usually has 3 parts: a person or community in need, an intervention or what your program did, and an impact, what changed because of what you did. So here's one example. So we're talking about Maria here. She uses a wheelchair. When she first came to the program, she was isolated at home. Today, she has a part-time job, friends she meets through accessible transportation, and a new sense of independence. Now, what's missing from this, and this is just an oversight when I put this together, is I should have said what the program does. But this, you see here, though, that this is just more than a story. It's evidence of an impact that people can feel. Here's another. Our assistive technology initiative provided 4,000 devices this year is a useful data point, and there's a lot of ways that can be helpful. But if you add the human dimension, of Mr. Harris, who was a retired teacher who'd lost most of his sight, and what he can now do because he has that device, it's a whole lot more compelling. You're now bringing this to the Mr. Harrises that your listener or reader probably has in their life too. And another one. So Mrs. Lee's daughter had to miss work twice a week to care for her mother. Through our program, Mrs. Lee receives reliable daytime care and participates in social activities. So she's staying active and engaged, Mrs. Lee is thriving, and her daughter kept her job. Everybody can relate to this, and that impact is clear. The caregiving crisis in this country right now is something I think almost everybody's aware of. So that is really useful by itself. But then if you add the scale, the Lees are just one of the 120 families we served last year. Now you're also showing the value. The two together show that value. You've got the soul, the scale, equals value. Now one more. Let's go back to our earlier example. Our example already included many of the elements needed to illustrate impact. But now adding John's story brings it to life in a whole new way. Now, I know this is not necessarily the most realistic example. This is what happens when you're trying to make them up without using a real one. But I hope it serves as a reasonably decent example of how you can bring together different types of information to make it clear to anyone, even if they don't really know anything about your programs or necessarily the issues that your programs are addressing, why your work is important. So that wraps up the 3 C's: clarity, consistency, and compelling storytelling. But now I want to talk about tailoring your message for your audience and the environment. Even the clearest, most compelling story will miss the mark if it's told to the wrong audience or to the right audience in the wrong way. One size absolutely does not fit all. And that's not because facts change. It's because the focus does. And this is where I really wish I could see all the faces of anybody listening to this, because I can get myself into trouble talking about this. But this is also where the rubber really meets the road when it comes to why this matters for grant management. So I'm going to go ahead and wade in. We are in a knockdown, drag-out fight for funding for programs. And that's always true to a certain extent. But the current environment is, shall we say, particularly challenging. It is absolutely imperative that policymakers, including the people who ultimately decide whether or not your program is funded, understand why your program matters. Ideally, you want them to see your program and your overall mission as things that actually help them advance their agenda. But at the very least, they need to see your programs and mission as not inconsistent with their priorities. At the end of the day, if we want to convince somebody about the value of a program, we have to describe the program and its impact in terms that resonate with them, the person we are trying to convince, not us. So when the them changes, we have to regroup. We have to recalibrate to account for the shift in priorities and biases. And usually it means we need to change the way we're telling the story. And when we shift to an environment where our programs could be really on the chopping block, this can be a really hard sell in the advocacy world, for good reason. I don't think I'm going to go wrong by saying that what's driving you to do the work you do is a really basic sense of right and wrong. And as advocates, part of what you're doing is truly trying to change the way people think about the people you serve and the issues they face. And you know that judging a program's worth in stark return on investment terms often misses the point. In a lot of cases, the value is the impact on the individual who was better able to fully participate in their community as a result of your program. But the problem is the people who are looking for places to cut don't necessarily think that way. They're focused on things like cost per person, tangible impact on large numbers of people, really basic, sort of fundamental human needs, or how funding one program reduces costs in another. Now, we want them to support our work because it's the right thing to do. We want them to support our work because they care about ensuring the people we serve have the opportunities they should have. But at the end of the day, we need them to support our work for whatever reason they support it. So when telling our stories, when you're telling your story, you've got to frame that work through their lens, not the one we wished that they view the world through. The good news is the aging and disability networks often have an outstanding story to tell, even in that kind of context. It's just a matter of selecting the right examples and describing them in the right language that's going to resonate with the people you're talking to. So, and bottom line brass tacks, in a lot of cases, it is about connecting to reducing other costs, reducing nursing home utilization, reducing hospitalizations. Those can be a very compelling story for a lot of work in the social services world. So it's important to know your audience and to know their priorities and biases when you're dealing with a new group of people at an administration change, whichever direction we're going, for example. You got to know what they're coming in with as their priorities and biases. And it's important to avoid polarizing language. This is another thing that has always been true, but it's gotten both harder to do and become more important. I think everyone could come up with a list of many of the key words and concepts that are going to be lightning rods in today's environment. And there's always a list like that. Things that are just absolutely not on message for the current group of decision makers. And everybody could probably come up with that list, like I said, for right now. Where you can, I would definitely recommend going through your materials and revising them to remove these lightning rods from them so that people don't get distracted. But beyond that, it's just important to think about the language used by the different groups you might need to be reached. I'm not only talking about politics, but that's, of course, the elephant in the room right now, no pun intended. You want to think about what makes the people you're trying to reach, feel threatened. What causes them to roll their eyes? And that's where euphemisms can really create problems. So, for example, as grating as I know that this will be to many people in the social services world, be cognizant of using woke language right now. And reworking materials to reworking materials to avoid polarizing language is something that this is a place where you do probably need your comms people. Having somebody go through and do that as a deliberate task is always a good idea, because then you can make sure you're changing it in ways that are consistent. And that is something Team DWC can help with if that's something you're interested in. And I should take a quick detour here, and I probably should have said this at the beginning. Some of your programs have statutory requirements, or at least statutory authority, to do some things that are not necessarily popular with one side of the aisle or the other in Congress. And some of those are really important things. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting you should not do those things. I'm not at all suggesting you should stop doing work that your grants direct you to do, or that you should change language to try to cover up work you have done or currently do. And certainly, you should not change the way you operate programs to a way that goes against your core values. But what I am suggesting is that where you can, you focus on sharing the examples that enjoy broad support when you're illustrating what your programs do. So, for example, if I were a P&A, right now I would be highlighting work we did to help a state or community work together to address accessibility issues, rather than examples that depict the P&A as David to the state's Goliath. Don't get me wrong, I fully understand the importance of that latter mission. It's crucial. It's a big, important thing. But if you focus your storytelling there, it's not likely to persuade a skeptic about the value of the program, and it's probably not going to do good things for funding. Now, the good news is most of the work that most of you do doesn't change that much based on political shifts. It's just the way you talk about it that should. In general, what you want to do is focus on shared values. Words like opportunity and safety, health, education, community, all of those resonate across differences most of the time. And this was the same story for us at ACL. What we didn't change that much from one administration to the next. Most of our programs are formula grants. But the way we talked about our work definitely did. Under the Biden administration, we talked a lot about how our work advanced equity for older adults and people with disabilities, because equity was a big focus for the Biden administration. When the administration changed, we went back to talking about how we ensured older adults and people with disabilities had the same opportunities as everyone else. We're talking about the same work, and both of those things are true. We're not trying to pull something over on anyone. We're just showing how the work we do fits into the priorities of that administration. And again, fortunately, most of our work fits very nicely into bipartisan priorities. Another great example is value-based care. Under President Trump's first term, Secretary Azar was focused on value-based care at Health and Human Services, and that specifically was about shifting the focus in healthcare to paying healthcare systems and providers for helping their patients stay healthy, as opposed to a focus on paying for procedures and things that happen only when people are already sick or hurt. Well, if you're focused on reducing healthcare costs by helping people stay healthy, then you definitely want to be helping people stay healthy and independent and actively engaged in their communities. And so that is what the Administration for Community Living is all about. And so what we did is we reached out to the mothership, HHS. When the speechwriters were looking for examples of human services, we made sure that we framed what we do in the context of supporting value-based care. We talked about how our programs, where it was true, where we could actually say this, reduced hospitalizations. They help people avoid more expensive nursing home care. We focused on those things because those fit into the priority agenda item, and ultimately got our programs brought into things where they otherwise may have been forgotten. So I know there are circumstances where it's not going to be possible to square the circle, so to speak. If a big part of your overall mission is at odds with the administration priorities, but you get federal funding to do a specific program that isn't, consistency in your overall messaging may well be a bridge too far. In those situations, the best you really can do is make sure that when you're talking about the federally funded program, you really highlight the firewalls if they exist that ensure federal funding is only going to the things that are aligned. Or you talk about it as a concrete thing and don't bring in the organizational messaging as much. But when you have programs that don't have that issue, where you can, you want to make sure that you're using clear, consistent, compelling language. You pretty much do that all the time. Avoiding the polarizing language, and doing that in examples across all of your communication products, and including your program applications and other grant documents, particularly your performance reports and places where you are providing the concrete examples of what you did with funding at some point in the past. Lead with common goals rather than contested terms. For instance, instead of framing your work as fighting inequality, you might say you're expanding opportunities. Again, not changing what you're doing, just changing the language of how you talk about it. So I want to end where we started. Effective communication is more important than ever in today's environment. It really is critical to have a consistent message that's easily understood, that speaks to the people who make decisions about your programs. And you want to take every opportunity to illustrate the impact of your work. You want to ensure consistency across materials, websites, social media, email signature blocks, and your grants documents, because the language you use in all of them, and at speaking events and in emails, all of that is working together to tell a story. So you want to make sure it's working for you. I want to remember that every document reaches a lot more people than the primary audience. Like, grant documents serve a specific purpose, but they're also where your program officers go when they're looking for examples of program accomplishments to help them advocate for your programs. So when I was at ACL, your performance reporting helped inform speeches by our administrator and other senior leaders. We used them to find material for the blog post we wrote for anniversaries and observances. And we drew heavily from them to write the program accomplishment section of the agency's congressional budget justification. And side note there, if that's not something you're familiar with, I'd recommend take a look at, if you go to acl.gov/budget and look at the 2025 congressional budget justification, for example. Only read the whole thing if you really are having a hard time sleeping. But if you look at the different programs in the program accomplishment sections, you can see how we tried to take the things that you're putting into performance reports, which in some cases are very specific examples of a person, and putting them into a broader context about how this talks about the program as a whole, where you can provide those kinds of information to the federal agencies that are funding your programs. You're making it easier for them to advocate for you. Another important thing to remember is AI is making it easier and easier for anyone to quickly scan all or most of your communications. And that allows them to spot inconsistencies, as well as to quickly distill what your overall message is. And all joking aside, that's why the MOM test is useful. Always assume that you could be informing someone with your products who doesn't know anything about your program or the people you serve. Again, you don't have to, in every single document, if you're writing to your program officer, they don't need what your program does explained in really basic terms. But where you're providing the examples, just remember that they're being used to talk to people who might not be from your world. So before we wrap up today, I just want to share a few of the ways Team DWC can help you. We're here if you need more customized one-on-one help with the things I've been talking about here today. And Team DWC also can help with the broader issues of managing federal grants. And if you've participated in any of the other webinars, you've heard some of these. If you'd like more information about any of these, just submit this form, which you can find on teamdwc.com. And last, I have a quick preview of the next webinar in the Inside Grant series. Incentive pay is one of the most common compliance traps for grantees. And that's especially true at the end of the year and during the holidays. So our next webinars will give you an overview of what's allowed and practical strategies for avoiding some of the common mistakes. We're actually going to do this one 4 times over 2 dates. You can join Scott Moore and Karina Stiles on November 19th, or you can join Scott Moore and Aaron Taylor on December 10th. And you can register for the session that works best for you at teamdwc.com. If you have any questions about the things I've shared here, feedback on the webinar, or things you'd like to see us cover in future webinars, we would love to hear them. Please send those to insidegrants@teamdwc. And with that, I will return you to your regularly scheduled day. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great afternoon.